Good afternoon and a warm welcome to this BCR webinar on moving towards a net zero positive economy in the coffee sector. My name's Paul Rook, I'm the Executive Director of BCA, and as an association we've been keen to put together a range of topics of which this is the first, and I'm sure the content today will stimulate some thoughts and questions as well as hopefully giving some strategic pointers to you all. Today is also part of a wider overall BCA strategy review, which sees us reaching out and increasing visibility in a number of different ways. Already we're looking at how associations globally can liaise more closely on some of the industry-wide challenges that are coming over the horizon. If you're not currently a member, then we'd love to hear from you. So today's topic, which is being recorded, so you will be able to pick up and review the webinar again at your leisure, is one on which our Sustainability Committee has been very actively involved and very well steered by the committee co-chairs who are our moderators today. So you will shortly hear from Krisztina Szalai, but first I will hand over to Victoria Moorhouse. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Victoria Moorhouse. I chair the Sustainability Committee of the BCA with Krisztina, and I'm Head of Sustainability for Costa Coffee as well. And today, what we'll be doing is, as you can see from the agenda, we've got two guest speakers, Tom, who is from Natural Capital Partners, and Peter Andrews from the British Retail Consortium. Krisztina and myself will be introducing Tom and Peter shortly, but we just wanted to give a very quick overview, building on Paul's introduction, of why this topic is so important today. And I've just got a few opening comments and then I'll hand over to Krisztina briefly. So I think climate change is really very much the defining business issue of the 2020s. That's something that is we hear bantered around certainly in sustainability circles quite a lot. And building back greener is a theme that is taking grip globally, both from a business and a government perspective. So in the UK, announced it last year, the UK government set a climate neutral goal for 2050, in Scotland 2045. And last month, China actually announced it was going carbon neutral by 2060. We saw in May that 150 global businesses with a combined capital value of 2.4 trillion signed a joint statement calling on all governments to align to make sure that the coronavirus economic response actually had climate science built into it. It's definitely a trend that is catching on. So far this year, 992 companies have set science-based carbon initiative targets, and just in the last 5 months, that's gone up by 124 companies. So definitely rising. And I think the key point here is that collective action is absolutely key to tackling climate change. You can't work on it as any one business. It has to happen across the whole value chain, from retailers to suppliers to customers, which is why collaborative platforms and information sharing, such as today's event for the British coffee sector, are so important. So I'm really looking forward to this session, and I'll just hand over quickly to Krisztina for her to give a few thoughts. Krisztina, over to you.
Thanks, Victoria. And as you said, very rightly so, the collective action here is really important. And that's really where the emphasis of this webinar is, especially when we are dealing with some large-scale issues like climate change. Climate change for all of us, as we know, is one of those topics that can both divide and unite people and organizations. And it can also feel really overwhelming, in my experience, considering that the issue at hand just seems to be so big and beyond our personal or even business level that it can be difficult to see what is our role in it and how to even get started. I think for this audience here, we don't need to go into great detail about why we need to take action about climate right now, but maybe a little bit of a reminder, a bit of a moral boost here. I wanted to make a note about, why is it still not too late to act, even despite all the alarming statistics that are coming out from science. It's just to remind everyone, at the International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC has been working on providing scientific assessment on climate change for over 30 years. But 2 years ago, they published a special report on global warming that confirms that while climate change is already affecting people, ecosystems and livelihoods all around the world, as we can see it for ourselves, limiting warming to 1.5 Celsius is still possible based on the laws of chemistry at least, but only on the basis that it would require unprecedented transitions to climate-conscious economy in all aspects of society. And while there's clearly an urgency around the subject and an urgency to find the most effective and efficient solutions available to us, in my experience at least, what can hold companies back from taking action is not knowing where to start or how to balance ambitious targets, future targets with realistically achievable goals. And when it comes to the language of carbon neutrality or carbon finance or climate change, there's a lot of jargon and a lot of terminology that's been we are giving birth to over the last few years, and certainly over the last few months even. And carbon neutrality is one of those consumer-facing declaration of corporate environmental commitments that is easy to understand. And while it is one of the most and longest used term in the industry, it is certainly not the only one and the only pathway a company can have. So people engaging, and I'm sure all of you have come across with different terminologies related to science-based targets or renewable energy 100, carbon positive, carbon negative, carbon neutral, and even all the way to goals becoming to net zero. But what it actually means to us, this is what this webinar is going to focus on and hopefully shed some light on. So at Taylors of Harrogate, I'm sustainable sourcing manager as well as acting coffee buyer at Taylors of Harrogate. And what we had certainly felt the weight of the task when we first started our carbon journey over 7 years ago. And at that point, we had the good fortune to have come across an organization and some incredibly knowledgeable and passionate people who guided us through our first steps and hope they'll continue to guide us through our journey from carbon neutrality over to carbon and net zero. So it is therefore a pleasure to introduce you to the person and the organization who helped us take these first steps, Tom Popple and Natural Capital Partners. Tom is Senior Manager of Climate Change and Sustainability at Natural Capital Partners, an organization that has more than 20 years experience in climate solutions, which technically makes them the longest running organization, helping companies design and deliver their corporate climate programs, including carbon neutrality, but also extended to climate financing, carbon offsetting, as well as work around reforestation, community and livelihoods. Tom leads within the organization a client program development in the European team at Natural Capital Partners, specializing in the design of climate action programs that deliver impacts across the business, both operational, supply chain and customer locations. And I guess on a side note as well, Tom, hope you don't mind me saying that you're a self-confessed climateholic, using your term, with a passion for climate action and combined with your immense knowledge and experience in helping leaders deliver on climate and sustainability goals. And you are here to help us expand our understanding and get clear on what are the next steps for us individually as well as collectively towards a more balanced carbon economy. So Tom, it is a pleasure to hand the stage over to you.
Thank you, Krisztina, and what a build-up of expectation that is now on my shoulders. So thanks very much for that. I've navigated the first hurdle by ensuring that my microphone isn't on mute, so my confidence levels are exceptionally high. So as Krisztina mentioned there, we've been operating for over 20 years, almost 25 years now. And for us as an organization, carbon neutrality and net zero isn't something new. Right back in our pioneering days, we created standards and protocols to allow companies and organizations to reach their net zero or their carbon neutral objective. And we've evolved over time as this system, the market, the infrastructure and corporate willingness and committedness to engage on this topic has evolved and matured significantly. So on one hand, I appreciate that for many organizations, they are coming to this with fresh, eager eyes and open-mindedness into something new. But for us as an organization, we've been doing this for a very long time. And it's just a snapshot of the brands that you see on the screen there. And we currently work with coming up to, I think, 400 different companies around the world, supporting their global operations to achieve their goals, which is an increasing litany of different phrases of carbon neutral, net zero, restorative, positive, negative, and there's probably something else there that's going to be coming in the future too. Our job is to tailor those programs to meet those goals. Just go to the next slide there for us. So what I did want to share, just to kind of open up was a little bit of research that we've done. So this is publicly available information. You can find it on our website for anybody that wants to reach out direct. We can talk about it too. But what we wanted to do last year was take a look at all of the economy. Really, we wanted to get a sense for which companies were taking action and where, and we tried to find a bit of a benchmark segment to look at. And so we landed on the Fortune Global 500. We thought it was a representative sample generally of business globally. And what we wanted to track was, what are the commitments being made, and can we relate this overwhelming feeling today that lots of companies are making commitments, and track that over time and see if that actually is real, or whether we're just drinking the Kool-Aid. So what you see on the screen now is the most recent research, taking a look at the Fortune Global 500, and you can see that since 2015, which is the signing of the Paris Agreement, the big commitment to limit global warming, where businesses were invited in to be part of the solution, we've seen a huge growth in corporate commitments from this segment of businesses to achieving some level of net zero emissions. And so within organizations, you have different emission sources and different challenges. And there are initiatives now that have been created to support businesses in achieving their goals and to set frameworks and guidance and standards for doing so. So you have the SBT, as it's listed there, the Science-Based Target Initiative, to support long-term decarbonization of a business, to ensure that it aligns to the science that was laid out in the IPCC reports and I guess charismatically the Paris Agreement. The RE100 initiative focused specifically on a type of emission source, which was the electricity consumption of businesses, and their aim for large businesses and all businesses to transition to 100% renewables. And then within that, you have carbon neutral objectives, and then you have net zero overall. So the key takeaway from looking at this chart is the growth since the end of 2015 of all these organizations and businesses committing to some form or some level of carbon neutrality and net zero. If you scroll to the next slide for me there, and just to dig a little bit deeper into that, what I really wanted to draw out, first of all, on the left-hand side there, was just some of the commonalities. So figure number 4, as it shows the little arc moons you can see here. So what we find is, with companies that have science-based targets commitments, actually 50% of them, 48 here, almost 50% of them also have a carbon neutral commitment. So it's both. It's not about either or, because science-based targets is a long-term commitment. You are going to achieve zero emissions by 2040, 2050, whatever your specific goals you've set. But actually, companies want to go further than that. They want to say that they're reducing all of their emissions today. They want to be carbon neutral today alongside their science-based target commitment. So we see those two combined, and they use carbon credits and offsetting and climate financing to achieve that carbon neutrality. And then the same in the blue moons there with the RE100 commitments, we see that those businesses that have an RE100 commitment, 33% also have a carbon neutral commitment, which means they're delivering or aiming to deliver emission reductions as soon as possible. And then you can see the arcs below actually did try to show the opposite there, which is saying, actually, of those with science-based target commitments, which ones don't have an immediate or midterm carbon neutral commitments? Only 16% of companies that have a science-based target don't have some form of carbon neutral commitment. And then again, 8% with RE100. So what does this show? This shows us that companies are using these systems and frameworks to deliver their goals over different time periods and to achieve it with different emission source challenges. The right-hand chart is just showing you the percentages of those businesses that are aligning and assigning themselves to each of those activities. So you can see they're carbon neutral, the green one. What we have is 6% of those organizations are carbon neutral today, which means that they are measuring their emissions and then they are offsetting the residual emissions to achieve neutrality today. The next kind of shading of that green is a further 5% have a target to be carbon neutral by 2030, and then a further 6% have kind of kicked it really into the long grass there with the target by 2050. And the same, you can see the charts there in RE100, similar kind of tee-up, science-based targets the same. And then the light blue column, the net zero one, second from the end, really that's not something which people are achieving today. We haven't had, in this research at least, companies that have committed and delivered net zero today. They're all for the future. So we can see there actually there are signs there to the 2050, or 1% into 2030, and then 6% of those have 2050 targets. Key takeaway from this research is it's not necessarily either or, it's generally a combination of these, and it's about time. Net zero and science-based targets is about longer term goals. Carbon neutrality is about achieving emission reductions today, same as the RE100 initiative. Next slide, please. To combine with that, 2 years ago now, it must be, following Paris, there was a call actually out to the business community to get involved and to outline how they can help achieve a net zero economy. It was something called the Talanoa Dialogue. Talanoa is actually a Fijian way for people in communities to come together to solve complex or challenging problems that they may have. And so Fiji was hosting a particular climate change conference back in Bonn in 2017. And what they said was, we're going to take this way of bringing people together to talk about issues and apply it into climate change and climate action. So the Talanoa Dialogue called out for organizations to support with the knowledge gathering and inspiration from business. And we hosted 7 Talanoa events all over the world to bring together businesses, 61 companies, as you can see there, to talk about how they're going to achieve a net zero economy. And I had the privilege of being involved in lots of those in Europe. If you go to the next slide, what we found was, if you just build the slide out for me, all the way through for me, what you actually see here is that there are companies themselves view the roadmap to net zero in 2 ways, and this kind of dovetails nicely to the research that we have as well. So one actually is, how do we get to carbon neutrality today? How do we think about it? Well, actually we think about it in different types of prints. It's not just about your footprint, but it's about some other prints. And I guess we had some really clever marketing people that came along to these Talanoa events representing some media industries, and that's how they thought about it, and they helped frame this for us. So you have your footprint. These are your direct operational emissions. These are things that you can control within your business. So you may have heard the emission source scopes, scope 1, scope 2, business travel, which is a scope 3. They're all part of your footprint as a company. You need to manage that, and you need to reduce that to achieve carbon neutral. But it's not just that, it's going upstream and downstream. So when we go upstream into your supply chain, that's considered to be your tail print as you go through. And then you have your handprint, which is the products and services, the impact that you have on your consumers and your communities and your ecosystems downstream as well. And there are some great examples of companies that have led the charge in those footprint considerations. So Microsoft, being a big pioneer, huge carbon negative program now as it may be, have delivered an effective carbon reduction program for their footprint through an internal carbon fee program, which is open source. And for anybody that hasn't looked at it, it is your one-stop shop for understanding how you can develop an internal program to help fund, innovate, and deliver on carbon neutrality. In the tail print, and I'm sorry to use this as an example, Krisztina, but it's a wonderful example. Betty's Taylor's, Yorkshire Tea, being able to consider the the impacts upstream into their product supply chain, looking at origin, looking at source, looking at what they need to reduce that footprint, and then deploying pretty smart, clever climate financing to develop projects in their supply chain that can reduce emissions, ultimately to have a product that is carbon neutral. And Interface, which is a poster child of sustainable business, is a great example in that area as well. And then we have handprint, so companies that are looking to deliver carbon neutral products and services and reduce those impacts downstream. And Elopak, one of my favorite companies based out of Norway, they have a wonderful program around the carbon footprint and decarbonisation of their paper packaging business. So they're very similar to Tetra Pak. But beyond that, to get to net zero, really what they were saying was, we're businesses. We are absolutely badass at doing plans. We have an accounting team that's top notch, a marketing team is top notch, our commercial team are right there, our leadership team. We are awesome at doing business. So can we apply our business strategy to sustainability, to climate, to net zero? How do we think about that? And so they thought about it in these 4 ways. Brainprint. So put the transformation of a net zero economy into the way that you do your business, into the heart of the business strategy. There's a great example there from ING for anyone that wants to really see this in action. ING have an initiative called Terra, and it's about applying the science-based targets initiative, the Paris goals, to the financial lending that they deliver. Again, they completely open sourced it, a real pioneer in sustainable financing and climate action, put it to the core of who they are as a business. Blueprint. So again, companies are great at doing plans, but think about that ecosystem. Think about where you are, who can you partner with? And this is a great example for the BCA. You know, you bring people together and you convene, but can you collaborate? Can you cross-pollinate? Can you apply different advances in innovation and technology to deliver goals? Fingerprint, crucial, absolutely crucial. When you operate a business, but it's your employees that deliver your company. So if you're not engaging your employees on climate action, if you're not enthusing them and inspiring them and getting them to follow your blueprint, your plan, your carbon emission reduction strategy, then really you're going to fall at the first hurdle. And there's some great examples within the fingerprint that we see. And then finally, newsprint. It's about value. It's about communicating your brand, your values to consumers and to your wider audience. And you can do that through effective communications. Be an advocate for change. We've got Intel and Intuit there, but actually a great one of these is Sky Group. You know, Sky having a fantastic net zero strategy and program that they deliver against. And for anyone, I would say read that out. You can skip that slide for me, slide 9. If we go on to slide 10 for me there. So when we are thinking about a journey that businesses go on, this is pretty much it. Now, this is two-dimensional. It is not like that. And many of these activities run in parallel. But let's just think about it simply for a second here. So what we have on the vertical axis is impact and value creation for a company. What you have on the bottom there is carbon reduction. So the kind of foundation piece here is measure your footprint, be more efficient, and report that, disclose it publicly. And we kind of call those the CDP group, those organizations that are kind of there, they're disclosing their reporting, but it's not necessarily revolutionary in what they're doing. Next level up from that is about decoupling. You want to continue to grow as a business, you want to be successful, but you don't want to have a continued growth in your carbon footprint. The Science Based Targets Initiative and their roadmaps are fantastic for companies to decouple their business growth from their emissions to ultimately become net zero in the future. Next level up from that, we consider to be an inflection point. We call it the zero north. This isn't our phrase, it's somebody else invented that, but I've absolutely plagiarized it for the benefit of this session here. And it's getting to zero. And that goes back to that research at the beginning. Zero can mean your whole company. We think about, you know, a carbon neutral company, but it could also mean zero for a particular emission source like RE100, which is your electricity. So you're getting to a point where you're reaching zero and you're using different mechanisms for doing so. But really the doozy, the kind of the leadership space here is how do you do all of those things, but then deliver greater impact beyond your organization and way beyond just carbon. And so we see positive as a phrase that comes up often, and positive can mean, you know, additional impacts that your company can create. So if we think about a climate financing program, you could, for example, be carbon neutral. You could use carbon offsetting and credits to achieve neutrality or to achieve net zero if you want to go down the reforestation route. But that project delivers way more than just carbon. It delivers societal impacts, educational impacts, equality impacts, biodiversity impacts, and we can measure all those. So we apply a framework of the SDGs onto all of the projects and activities that we have, in addition to some other frameworks that companies maybe may care about, and we can report and communicate positive impacts. If your projects go beyond zero on carbon, you also have a positive carbon impact as well. And then finally, at the very top of that kind of sphere is really everything you do as a company and the way that you think about your projects through climate financing are restorative. You do greater good, you are restoring, you are healing, you're going way beyond just achieving neutrality or net zero. So net zero, carbon neutral as it is not an end game. And this is really important to understand. It's an inflection point. It is a point that you have to go through as a business in order then to access and create greater impact and positive, and positive outcomes. Next slide for me. Next slide, skip through that one just for a second. So when we're thinking about an organization over time, this is what we're framing here. 2050, that's our net zero goal. And what I want to talk about here is the strategy that you need to deploy as an organization. How do you think about this? very simply, you need to consider your carbon footprint as an organization being divided into two buckets. One of those is what we consider avoidable emissions. It can also be called abatable emissions. And they're the emissions that you have control over and you have access to technology and finance to deliver emission reductions. For example, switching to renewables, becoming more energy efficient, upgrading your fleet, things that you can control to reduce your footprint over time. The green segment there is unavoidable emissions. So at that given point in time, in that year, let's say 2020, you still have emissions that you're unable to reduce. They're unavoidable emissions. And the only mechanism that you have available to achieve carbon neutrality for that given year is what we call climate financing. And that is offsetting your emissions. And to be really clear, absolutely black and white and total myth busting here as well for anyone, and maybe it's going to blow your mind, but any emission reduction outside of your organization is an offset. It is a carbon offset. Carbon offsetting then actually can be achieved using 3 different emission reduction approaches. One of those is carbon removals. We can restore, we can replant forest, removes carbon from the atmosphere, removal. The second category is we're avoiding an emission being released into the atmosphere, protecting the Amazon rainforest, protecting the rainforest in Borneo. If we protect that forest, we are stopping it being cut down and emissions being released from the land that that forest sits on. And then finally, an emission reduction, which is something like renewable energy displacing fossil, or some of you may have seen improved cook stoves, for example, reducing emissions. So any emission reduction outside your operation is a carbon offset. And there are 3 different mechanisms: removal, avoidance, and reduction. And the unavoidable emission segment in your strategy is using one of those 3 mechanisms to achieve your carbon neutrality. Right now, today, guidance from SBTi and also Oxford University says that if you want to achieve net zero, you have to balance your footprint with carbon removals. So you're only eligible to use one of those mechanisms in order to achieve net zero. So you can be carbon neutral using all 3, net zero using just one of them. If you just scroll to the next slide, and I'm conscious of my time here. This is an example from H&M's climate positive strategy. And I think, again, you can totally see how I ripped off some of their wonderful decreasing segments of triangles there. But for anyone that hasn't seen it, it's a great example of combining that program over time with that journey that I showed where you get to restorative. So in this program here, H&M are about building climate resilience and climate sinks. Unavoidable emissions. You can see all the language is there in a really sophisticated and very simplified program here. And then next slide for me on this one here. I want to headline this really quickly. I mentioned Microsoft in their carbon fee program, which describes what they do. They then decided to go the next level, almost next planet, to be fair, in what they wanted to commit, and they wanted to get to a cut beyond net zero and go to a carbon negative standpoint. What you see on the chart on the left hand side is their emission profile over time. As you can see, the dark red there represents their operational emissions, that's their footprint. The blue represents their supply chain emissions, that is their tail print and their handprint, if we want to think about it in that way. And what you see in the dark green is where they were using offsets to achieve carbon neutrality. And then in the light green is where they're going to be using carbon removals to achieve some level of net zero. So this is a great example of how a company has started their journey. They began with a great plan and policy. They moved through to carbon offsetting, carbon neutrality, and then they used the carbon offsetting through removals to be aiming to be net zero. And eventually they're going to fund so many projects that they become negative as a business. And we have the good fortune of been working with them since the inception of their program. So I'm going to stop there because I'm out of my time, and Julie, as I anticipated, I didn't get through everything I wanted to, but I hope that's a real great taster and really gives you a sense of what's possible and what that looks like.
Thanks, Tom. That's absolutely great. Thank you for whizzing through those slides so quickly, because that's actually a really complicated topic that you managed to boil down into 20 minutes. So thank you for that. So without further ado, what I'll do is I will introduce our next speaker, which is Peter Andrews, who is Head of Sustainability Policy at the British Retail Consortium, or the BRC, not to be confused with the BCA, which I do often. So the BRC is a trade association for retail businesses with the purpose to make a positive difference to the retail industry and the customers it serves today and in the future. So Peter has been leading on the development of the BRC's climate roadmap this year, which gathers retailers together to decarbonise, basically working in collaboration to work out how they can reach a net zero target ahead of the UK's 2050 target. So I will hand over to Peter to talk more about the retail roadmap and tell you all about the work that the BRC are doing. Peter, over to you.
So the British Retail Consortium has been developing a roadmap to get the retail industry to net zero as quickly as possible. We're aware of the UK's target for the whole country to be net zero by 2050, and actually, if you've got operations in Scotland, you'll need to be net zero by 2045. We also knew that the climate issue was a very political issue in the last general election, and most of the opposition parties had much more ambitious climate targets than the current government. So we wanted to make sure that our industry moves forward as fast as it can do to decarbonise ahead of the legally binding commitment, but also ahead of any potentially forthcoming regulation. And that we do it in a way that we can bring everyone on board and provide a collaborative forum to drive efforts both within the retail industry, but also working with our key stakeholders and key partners. So we've been working on this roadmap for about 9 months now, and we'll be launching it next month. And as part of the process, we reached out to critical stakeholders to get a better understanding of what their expectations are of us. So as you can see on this slide, some of it probably won't surprise you. Many of our stakeholders, whether they are NGOs, whether they are government, whether they are supply chain partners, said that we need to act as a leader. So the retail industry is in a great position that it's at the front of vast international supply chains and also has that customer interface, so is able to influence in both directions quite well. And in fact, our carbon impact is probably 90+% outside of our direct control, so 90+% outside of our operations. So we needed to be a leader. We needed to align with a 1.5 degree target, and I was listening to Tom's presentation earlier, and it's great to see the sort of international efforts that are focusing on this, whether it's through science-based targets or through other types of initiatives. And our members, as our stakeholders told us that the supply chain and the customer impacts are really critical, and we've got a real role to play in driving decarbonisation in both of these areas. And no matter how challenging it is, the more we can collectively demonstrate to our suppliers a consistent expectation from them to decarbonise, the better it is for everyone. And also then looking at our customers, the more we can have consistent messaging to our customers around climate impacts, the easier it is for them to understand how they can change their own behaviours to decarbonise their lifestyles. Our stakeholders also told us there were many tricky issues with regards to decarbonising, and from a retail industry perspective, particularly our supply chain was around heavy goods vehicles. So at the moment, the technology is not quite there yet to decarbonise the heavy goods vehicles, so we need to focus on that and move as fast as we can. And then we do have challenges around meat and dairy consumption, and what we can do in this area without I guess becoming a nanny state in a way to our customer base. So what more we can do there. And then, you know, our stakeholders told us that there's a real willingness to work with our sector if we do take on board a lot of their thoughts and perspectives. If we go on to the next slide. So we are going to announce our targets next month. So I'm afraid I can't actually tell you what they are going to be. I can say that they are going to be quite a way ahead of the 2050 target, which is excellent. And what we're doing is we're looking to split the targets up. So we believe we can get the retail industry to net zero pretty fast. And the first thing that we can achieve is through our scope 2 emissions, and that's the purchased electricity. We believe we can get that, we can decarbonize that very, very quickly. Then there's a slight of a challenge with the scope 1, so that's the combustion of the fuels of the refrigerants in the refrigeration that we own, but we believe that we can get there in quite a good time frame. And then our wider ambition, our longer term ambition, is to move to net zero, working with our suppliers. So for the products that we sell as retailers in the UK market, we want those to be net zero by a target date. So we're announcing this on the 10th of November, and in some ways it's aligned with other roadmaps or other announcements that are coming out on where business is aiming to get to net zero. But you know, as soon as we do announce it, we want to be engaging with all of our supply chain partners to work through what it means for each of us, and how we can all work together most effectively to get to net zero. So if we go on to the next slide. So under the umbrella of those targets, what we're looking at is we've segmented it into 5 different pathways. So looking at, firstly, how we use greenhouse gas emissions data to make business decisions. Secondly, looking at our stores, our sites, our warehouses, to make sure that they are powered by renewables. Thirdly, looking at the logistics. As I mentioned, there's some big challenges there for retail. Fourth, how we source our raw materials and our products. And lastly, how we engage our employees and our customers to help them live low carbon lifestyles. As part of our roadmap, we're setting out a number of asks to government, because we recognise that for us to move forward as quickly as possible, we need government to help us move forward there. And that could be, you know, we could, you know, in 5 years' time, maybe put all light goods vehicles on the roads to be electric ones. However, if we don't have the right charging infrastructure across the country, then they're going to be stranded assets. So we need to make sure that the infrastructure and the enabling framework is there for our industry and every industry to move to net zero as quickly as possible. If we go on to the next slide, I'll just delve into an example of how one of these sort of pathways could look, or how the sort of milestones could look for the retail industry. So under the placing greenhouse gas emissions data at the core of business decisions, we'd hope that maybe in the next, I'll say 5 to 10 years, you can see it's question marks there, that we'll get a better understanding of greenhouse gas measuring and reporting amongst the retail industry. We'll work with our top suppliers to get to net zero, or to make, commitments to net zero and or science-based targets. And then we'll start gathering data, or retailers will start gathering consistent data from their suppliers, so they can start measuring their tier 1 emissions. And then a later stage, retailers adopting an internal cost of carbon, and having that data, the products data from their top suppliers, and then later on increasing that cost per tonne of that internal carbon price. So that's just a very example, and that's not necessarily how the roadmap is going to look for the first pathway here, but just to give you an indication of how we want to flesh this out, how we want to set out the steps to get to net zero as quickly as possible. You can see on the side what the sort of short-term policy asks may be if we went down this route, and what the role of a trade body like BRC would be in this area. If we skip on to the next slide, I think this may be the last one. So yes, just to clarify that we are launching this on the 10th of November. We've been working with the UN to launch this and build up momentum for this. We do have COP26 happening next year, so again, we're wanting to work with the UK government to accelerate this as fast as possible. So I guess, you know, just want to finish by saying we recognise, like many other industries like yourselves, that we need to accelerate our action to tackle climate change. This we've found, the roadmap approach we found is a really useful one for an industry sector to take. And we know that there are other industry sectors that are going down this journey, and we want to join up as much as possible so we can work together as closely as we can do to decarbonise.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks very much for finding your way back into the webinar. It's really good to hear your summary as well. Just very briefly, we don't have many minutes left from the webinar, but we certainly have some time for a few questions. And we've got one coming through from the audience that I'd just like to read out to both of you probably. So either Tom, Peter, if you wanted to jump in on the back of this. So one of the questions is the balance right between voluntary commitment from businesses towards net zero and government legislation to force businesses to get there? So basically it's the interplay between voluntary standards and voluntary commitments versus government legislation. And do either of you have any views on that you wanted to share?
I can quickly jump in there, Peter from BRC. Look, we know that the government legislation is changing, is going to change and needs to change to move everyone along this journey. But there still is a lot of room for voluntary action by businesses to be ahead of that, which should be, I guess, you know, more cost effective if they go down the voluntary route before being hit with regulation. But we know that at the moment the Treasury is looking at a carbon tax to apply to the UK as we leave Europe. So we may have an emissions trading scheme to replace the EU ETS. But we know that the government is seriously looking at what legislation it can put in place as the UK leaves the EU. But as businesses, we can come to the table and say, look, we can move fast in this direction. We need your help, and this is how we can work together.
That's really great. Thanks, Peter. I can't personally see any further. Yeah, say that again.
Just to add to that, Krisztina, slightly, just taking a global view too. From that, so if you think about most multinationals, they operate in multiple jurisdictions. So, you know, government incentives and legislation, you know, need to be in unison. I think that's one of the challenges and calls, obviously, within the global climate change negotiations. But also, you know, it's important to reflect that there are some organisations, individually, some companies that are bigger generally in their revenue and their impact in some countries. You know, some of the big tech companies alone are more valuable and larger than the whole of the FTSE kind of 100. So yeah, there is a huge role to play in terms of the impact and scale and ambition of businesses. And often we see in our world that business goes first and that the government actually then follows second with a kind of policy or regulation for the lowest common denominator to bring the rest of the business world forward. But it's always leaders with voluntary action who set the ambition first.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Tom. We've got a few more minutes. I just have one question to probably both of you, and that's sort of circling back to the beginning of the webinar. Obviously, we started setting the scene with the British Coffee Association being a collaborative platform of individual organisations coming together and discussing and thinking about solutions that are relevant for all of us in this industry. So when it comes to carbon and climate solutions, have you either of you have any good examples that you might have seen in any other industry, perhaps, around collaboration when it comes to climate action?
Maybe just to step in there first, I think a really good example, we're kind of relatively close to them as well, is in the media industry. And so BAFTA have a fabulous system for looking at sustainability and climate impacts of productions. So they have the Albert tool and the Albert Consortium, which brings together all the major broadcasters and anybody in the production houses. I think that just represents best in class from an industry collaboration. It's for the interest and benefit of the industry and all the stakeholders, and they use that as a mechanism to ratchet up ambition and impact. So I think that's a great one. But I would say from our landscape that these collaborations are very few and far between. And I would say that within the BCA, there was a huge opportunity to collaborate, given that if you're looking upstream into your supply chain, you're going to be facing similar issues and likely sourcing from similar locations. So there is advantage in terms of scaling solutions that can be effective.
And I'll just quickly add to that. So just two other examples would be the UNFCCC Fashion Charter for Climate Action. That's quite a good one for the fashion industry, working collaboratively across the world to tackle climate change. So one to have a look at.
Great, thank you, Peter. No, that's great. Those are really good points, and I'm sure it's a shame we don't have more time for questions actually, but we are almost out of time with 2 minutes to go. So I should probably hand over to Paul at this point, just to close the webinar. Paul, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks to you, Victoria, and to Krisztina for moderating, and really to our two presenters, and particularly Peter for overcoming the inevitable challenges of IT that we all face these days. And I mean, it picked up on two issues really that have interested me. You know, this idea of how do we change people's lifestyles, you know, whether it's consumers, you know, essentially all of us, because we all have a part to play in this going forward, and the critical issue of infrastructure going forward. But really, I joined a conference, a Canadian Association conference a week ago, and one of the points that was made there was, you know, we won't be talking about this in 5 years' time because it will be an issue that's embedded within business. And actually, I think the presenters today, and you know, certainly Tom to start with, has really given us an indication of actually how we might, as businesses, do that, but actually the economic and the environmental benefit of doing that as well. And this idea of pushing through from net zero being just one part of that sort of journey. But you know, the crucial factor that it's economically sensible to head in that direction. So hopefully people have enjoyed today's presentation. As we said, it's been recorded, and we will make the recording available to you all in the next day or two. We're wanting to run a number of other webinars. We have 1 or 2 sort of dates in the pipeline, so look out for more details on that. But we also want to put on events that, you know, are of interest to you. So if you have an idea of a webinar topic, you haven't seen it sort of covered, you think it ought to be, then let us know. Probably drop us a line at info@britishcoffeeassociation.org, and we can sort of take up the challenge of putting something on. So thank you to everybody for attending. Thanks to our contributors. Thanks to the IT people behind, and have a pleasant afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much.